these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey folks, welcome back. And today we are going to continue to the discussion on military whistleblowers. Got a great guest to really talk about that today. I think this would be one of our best whistleblowers. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier. You may remember this story back in May when you heard of a Space Force commander being fired for speaking out against Marxism. So I'm going to go with Matt. Matt, thanks for being on and sharing your story.
Thanks, Congressman. I appreciate it.
And let's tease out that story. Let's unpack that a little bit. So you had just taken over command, and as the story goes, as the public knows it, all of a sudden you're fired just for speaking out against Marxism. Is that oversimplifying it? I mean, what really happened here?
Well, first off, I'm always saying this in every interview or podcast that I do. These are my views, not those of the Defense Department, of course. But you're right. I took command a year ago. It was July of 2020. As your listeners would recall, that was in the aftermath of the George Floyd death. There were still riots taking place in the country. And of course, there was a lot of, you could call it social issues related dialogue throughout the country and division that was occurring. And I came into command at that point in time, and the COVID pandemic was also a new thing for us that we were sorting out as a country. And there were a lot of crises and issues over which I think people could get emotionally involved and divided. But that's the climate into which I come into command, take command of the space-based missile warning unit. And one of the things that I do right after I take command is I scheduled an interview with every member of my unit so that I could have a one-on-one dialogue with folks, learn where they're from, what their background is, how long they've been at the base, and any stressors they might be experiencing. And because it was a tough climate, I was interested in kind of taking some really good notes on folks that I was sitting down with. What that turned into is me starting to learn about some tension that was being generated at the ground level based on trainings that were occurring that I walked into or stepped into in command when I came in July, that I began to pay very close attention to from that point forward. Those trainings are labeled diversity and inclusion trainings. Most often, sometimes we had down days or virtual wingman days, as we would call them, to discuss issues of race in the country. And it was from there that I began to branch out and reach out to other friends who were in command elsewhere, friends who were serving at different bases around the world, to ask if they were noticing some of the same divisive tension that was occurring at my own base, at their bases as well. And, every base is a little bit unique, but there was a common thread that I began to pull on, and it was that there was a lot of emotion and division that was starting to appear. And in military speak, we refer to that as the undermining of good order and discipline, or it was beginning to impact morale. And so that's when I come into command. It's July, and that's kind of the setting, and that's when I start to pay very close attention to issues that I had studied for a long time, but didn't really appreciate until July and August of last year were actually starting to really dramatically affect the culture of our armed forces.
So, but how does that lead into being relieved of command? Is it because of the book that came out?
Yeah, that's the question you asked, I guess. And I was starting back there and forgot to go to where you asked. So because of what I was seeing, and this is the important point that I was actually wanting to make, I did my best to delicately use the chain of command at first, the internal mechanisms available to all service members, to point out my concern that our incessant focus on race discussions was starting to be quite divisive. And when I say I use my chain of command, I use the chain of command, like from my immediate supervisor on up. And when I felt like that wasn't getting much, now my leaders, to be clear, were sympathetic to the issue and they listened carefully. They're good leaders in so many ways. And so I'm not denigrating the leaders. They listened carefully. President Trump in September of last year came out with an executive order banning race and sex stereotyping. It was an executive order issued on the 22nd of September. And after that executive order came out, there was a sigh of relief that was essentially breathed by many service members that I've been talking to, thinking, okay, this is going to simmer down a little bit. And I think in many ways it did. However, one thing that I noticed was that there were base leadership sanctioned discussions that were continuing to occur. They were not base-wide down days, let's say, but they were reading clubs that were beginning to be established and advertised by base leadership, encouraging people to show up and discuss books like Ijeoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race, which talks about the white supremacist United States, denigrates the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and demonizes people based on their race, specifically whites. And so I attended a training discussing that book. Not only does it do that, it was exceptionally partisan because it recommended to these young, impressionable service members to which organizations they should be donating their free money.
Wow.
Organizations that have a very specific political bent, as you can imagine. And so with that happening still, even after the executive order, I filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's Office of the Space Force, detailing not only some of the issues specifically, which I do detail specifically, but also pointing out that it was in violation of an executive order from the Commander-in-Chief, also pointing out that it was rooted in critical race theory, and talk about just how dangerous that was. And I can't pretend to understand, following the filing of a formal complaint, exactly the conversation that takes place behind the scenes. So I won't insist that one thing did or did not happen any particular way. But what I can say is that after several months of waiting for a response, the response came back once the writing was on the wall, and we saw it seemed to me very politically charged, the decision. There was an acknowledgement of receipt of my complaint and the appropriate action had been taken. And then the new administration came in, and it was all around that same time. It was actually the day after the January 6th insurrection, so-called, that I got a response saying that that my complaint had been taken care of. And when I saw that, just how politically charged all of this is, and then the current administration, for example, this isn't a criticism, I'm stating a matter of fact, but repealed, or I should say abolished, that executive order that President Trump had issued on 22 September, and essentially came up with a new policy that allowed for critical race theory-based diversity and inclusion trainings to begin thriving in our Defense Department. And I just sense that there's not going to be any end to this anytime soon. We're going to continue to see division in the ranks unless we draw greater attention to this problem and have a really high-level dialogue about this. And so with that motive, essentially, and understanding just how dangerous the path is that we're walking on this identity politics path that's rooted in Marxism, I was feverishly scribbling out a book in my free time, which isn't much as a commander. And the Secretary of Defense invited all service members to draw attention to extremism when they saw it within the ranks. And that was kind of that was the last encouragement and nudge I needed, in addition to counseling with public affairs and legal before I published the book. But that it was important for me to publish the work. And so I published the work in May. It was publicly available on the 10th, and I was fired on the 14th. And my book was not cited as a reason for being relieved of command. A podcast that I had done with Todd Wood at CD Media was cited, and it was alleged that I was politically partisan while acting in an official capacity, and that's the reason I was being fired. And I deny that to this day. I wasn't acting in an official capacity, And I'm not interested in partisan politics being in our armed forces. In fact, I don't care what people's politics are. What I want to see as a non-political military institution that allows people, regardless of their politics, have a welcoming environment. We're always talking about inclusion, and yet there's a lot of people feeling not included at the moment, depending on what their political persuasion is. So, yeah, that's finally the answer to your question.
Yeah, it's good to unpack that. It does seem to me, and as we've looked at through some of the more egregious sort of woke whistleblower complaints, they overwhelmingly come from the Air Force. I mean, so what the hell is going on in the Air Force in particular? They already screwed up by not putting Navy ranks in the Space Force, because that would have been the obvious choice for the rank structure. And I'm sorry, but Lieutenant Colonel shouldn't be manning a spacecraft. It should be Captain. It should be the captain of the ship. But hey,
or like Space Lord.
Or
Space Lord or something.
No, it's instead of Guardians, it should have been Space Lords. that would have been better. That was actually an amendment that passed the House to make the Space Force use Navy ranks, but it couldn't get through the Senate because Air Force generals were all upset about it, and all of our boring senators wouldn't fight for it. So I'm really don't worry, it'll be in the next NDAA. And the American people will get their way eventually. There's a long history in American pop culture of Space Force having a Navy rank structure. Spaceballs, Star Wars, Star Trek. It's deeply ingrained in American culture. You can't escape that. But anyway, on a more serious note, although that I think that is pretty serious. Why the Air Force? I mean, why do I keep hearing all of this woke stuff come from the Air Force? It's not like it's only the Air Force, but it's overwhelmingly in the Air Force.
Well, that's news to me, actually. Now, so I can't answer that question specifically. In fact, since being relieved of command and being on podcasts and doing shows and things, it's only been since then that I've become overwhelmingly aware of this issue across the services, and not just in the Air Force, in fact. And when I wrote my book, while I traced through at the latter end of my book examples from all of the major service academies of this kind of permeating our service academies, our military institutions, I didn't really have a good picture that this was in fact something that was what I'll use the term systemic across all the services. And a good example of this is a book that I've just started reading a little more carefully, and it's Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Mm-hmm. Kendi's book is on the Navy's reading list, for example. Now, it's one thing to learn about critical race theory, Marxism, history of all bents, read Mein Kampf, read Mao Zedong, these are important things to understand and grapple with, because we have a different ideology in America that is rooted in a very particular philosophy that all men are created equal, and that individualism has merit as a political ideology, and it leads to greater outcomes. And so learning is one thing. It's a different thing altogether to infuse our institutions with the tenets and vocabulary of the woke religion.
And this is what I've told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, because he made this big defense of it in Congress, mistakenly so. And, trying to come up with this reasoning like, no, we're just teaching it so people understand it, just like I read all of these other ideologies. And it's like, sorry, but that's not what's happening. Okay, he's making a point, or he's countering a point that we aren't making, because the reality is, and as you've seen, is that these teachings are being propagandized. They're not just being taught for situational awareness.
Yeah, for example, to your point, Kendi's book in the introduction denigrates the U.S. Constitution. Right away. And it gives you a good flavor. So not only does it denigrate the Constitution, it calls the Constitution a colorblind or racist Constitution for a white supremacist America. But it also says that if you think you're not a racist, now that's the key. I mean, you're stuck. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Right. If you think you're not a racist, then you are like, and this is a direct quote, the Trumps and the other white supremacists of the world. Now, when military leaders, not leaders, that's not what I meant to say. When military service members are asked, and this is an important point, to have dialogue, so-called, about touchy or politically charged or emotionally charged topics like race at the moment. Dialogue in and of itself isn't a bad thing. In fact, if it can be done respectfully, it's a great thing. It's part of the greatness of America, is the fact that we can have dialogue and not resort to violence, let's say. But the context, however, matters a great deal in which that dialogue is begun. And so if the context is, hey, go watch these 2 videos first before you show up next Friday to discuss race, and those 2 videos happen to be very left-leaning in their political bent, and they demonize whites based on race, and they insist that we have 400 years of white supremacy in this country, and therefore the birth of the country is in 1619, and it's a push for the 1619 Project. I mean, all of that context then creates an environment of at least hesitancy, if not fear, where service members then show up, and these are unique, diverse individuals who have any number of thoughts about any number of topics, but the precedent has been established for what the acceptable viewpoint is going to be coming into the dialogue,
right,
and what the unacceptable viewpoint will be, and therefore people don't speak up out of fear of
right,
retribution or of being labeled something, right? And so that's what more than anything, I think that's what I've seen happen in many of our trainings and discussions, is that the context is awry, and the context happens to be created by those who are not, I'll put it more directly, the context is a parrot of those narratives that have been created by enemies of this country. People who hate the country and are trying to divide people deliberately. And that's where I had to draw a line and say we have to talk about this very openly. Otherwise, it will sneak its way in, and it will take us unaware.
And it's so disingenuous, right? Like, because the defenders of critical race theory, because this is really blowing up in our school systems. I mean, parents are getting pissed, and rightfully so, and it's awesome to see. But the defenders of critical race theory say, why won't you teach about slavery in this country? And it's like, that is not the point that we're making at all. There is not a single American that has grown up in the last 50, 60, 100 years that didn't grow up knowing all about slavery. We do, like, learning the story of Harriet Tubman in elementary school. These are the things that stick out to me. Of course we learned about it. It's like, stop lying to us. You're trying to propagandize a totally different story of America. This isn't about teaching history. It's an absolute lie. So I want to ask you about Marxism. The book's called An Irresistible Revolution. I kind of like that title, because that's what, as a conservative, that's sort of what we contend with, right? Is the irresistible nature of socialism, right? Because at first, like many Democrat ideas, at first they seem to be nice, and at first it seems compassionate. At first it seems like you hold some sort of moral high ground if you would just feel this way. And so I saw the title and I like it, but maybe expand on that, why you chose that title, and why is Marxism so irresistible?
Yeah, thanks. It's actually a part of a quote. When I first became aware and made a connection to some of the social activism that I was seeing across the country in the past calendar year with Marxist ideology, it was actually, as best I can remember, tied to my learning of an interview that was done with one of the founders of Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Khan-Cullors. She did an interview in 2015 where she said that she was a trained Marxist.
Yep.
And she said that another one of the co-founders of the movement, Alicia Garza, was a trained Marxist. And so I looked into that, and I verified that and learned about where they learned to be trained organizers, for example. And then I went to the Black Lives Matter website under the What We Believe section. And under that section, it used the language of critical, well, it used Marxist language, which is where we get our critical schools of thought, or the critical pedagogy. And it talked about dismantling cisgender privilege. It talked about disrupting Western prescribed nuclear family structures. It talked about the communal education of children, so long as the parents are okay with that. They've since changed the language and softened it quite a bit because it was getting a lot of flack. But one of the, I think she goes by they, is the co-founder of the Toronto Black Lives Matter movement, is Future Khan. I don't think that was unintentional name choice, Future Con. Future Con says that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. Mm-hmm. It has to be a fait accompli because the people that you're trying to cause to join the revolution have to buy into the causes of the revolution almost as a matter of, they have to truly buy into a basic set of underlying assumptions or beliefs about reality in the world they live in if they're going to coalesce and revolutionize the country. And I thought that was such an apt description of what organizations like Black Lives Matter are trying to accomplish. Use compassionate language. Use the fact that you care about groups of people. Use words like freedom and liberty and justice, because who doesn't like those things, right? And you get people to buy into these values, but they're redefined values. They're not just not racist, they're anti-racist. And that has a very particular meaning. And so at once you're able to identify who is a participant in the revolution and who is an enemy of the revolution, depending on what language they use in their social circles or on their social media pages. And so what I see in our military's diversity and inclusion trainings, unfortunately, so often was the language of the revolutionary. And we didn't know it. I think a lot of us did this unwittingly. But when we talk about dismantling things, we talk about privilege and we talk about unconscious and implicit biases that we have to rid and systemic racism within the services. That starts to, over time, create a new culture by and by, because people start to change their belief system. That changes their purpose and their values that they adopt. And here's the dangerous part. There are many people that will never buy into that. And so the force is fractured. And they start to be very skeptical of one another. And that has to be undone if we're going to have good order and discipline.
Yeah, it is strange how it infiltrates. It's very frustrating for conservatives to contend with, because it feels so organic, right? It's like you're contending with this almost religious like movement that speaks a different language. I mean, and they really do. Like you said, words are very carefully chosen, and then people are sort of inculcated into this culture and manner of speaking, which feels like they're almost, it's canonic. It's very religious. It's like singing from a hymnal. It's confusing, and you're like, well, where does it start? And you kind of grapple with trying to find out where it starts and where the source is, but it's very diffused. And it infiltrates these diversity and inclusion trainings in a very profound way. Because the diversity and inclusion training, I mean, who wouldn't want to know? If it's done honestly and in the right context, I suppose that could be somewhat beneficial. I've seen no evidence that even if it's done right, it would ever be beneficial. I think these things honestly just need to happen organically and through the course of human history. But I think the military is already very inclusive in the sense that everybody has to do the same thing.
I agree. The military, I've been in for 15 and a half years. My experience in the military as far as inclusion goes has been remarkable. Now, someone might say,
well, it's because you're white.
Unfortunately,
it's because you're white, man.
That's your white privilege speaking, right? But that's not been my experience. It really hasn't. It's not been many others' experience either until they were trained to believe otherwise. It didn't matter for the longest time if you had a black leader or a white leader leading troops, for example. No one paid close attention to that, because if they were professional and were a good leader, people would listen. There's a rank structure for a reason. We wear the same uniform for a reason, so that those things don't matter. And you mentioned the religious nature of this. I mean, it's the woke religion, some are calling it. James Lindsay, who focuses on, he's got that book, Cynical Theories, that he wrote with Helen Pluckrose, but he recently just published on his New Discourses website how the woke religion is essentially, potentially even, a violation of our Bill of Rights, because you've got government cozying up with a kind of religion that it's imposing potentially on its own people in the federal agencies. These are my words now, not James Lindsay's, but we would never push Christianity. We would never push Islam as a government down people's throats and insist that unless you believe this way, you're in the wrong. Mm-hmm. But the woke religion that you're talking about, essentially, it prescribes a certain kind of belief system It talks about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So who the enemies are, who is evil and who is good. It tells you about how to gain salvation, essentially, and it's to admit your racism, for example, and to become an anti-racist. At least, I mean, that's one example of how you do it. Whereas, say, let's say Christianity says you need to sacrifice the individual self in order to gain some eternal reward. Marxist ideology is completely the opposite. It's that you need to sacrifice other people for a peace and a paradise now in this world, in this country. You need to revolutionize the government.
It's such an important point.
So it's a religion.
Yeah, it's such an important point because the left likes to say, well, Jesus was a socialist, because he believed in charity. He said, no, the Bible teaches self-sacrifice. Okay, Marxism teaches the sacrifice of others. And here's another very important philosophical point. The Bible teaches that you are guilty for your actions. Okay, the Marxism teaches the opposite, that group guilt and generational guilt, which is not the Bible's teachings. I mean, our government and our Western civilization takes so much from the Bible, so much more than I can even know, really. Like, I'm not a theologian by any stretch, but I'm still mesmerized by how often I can find Bible verses that relate really well to our founding documents and the philosophy that creates prosperity. And so, the Bible is divinely inspired, and it does create outcomes that are superior. Nobody ever said perfect. Okay. And this is again, why is it an irresistible revolution? Because they promise utopia. Maybe that's another way to answer that question, because if you're promising utopia, well, of course it's an irresistible revolution. I want to ask you too about the sort of confession, the sort of like the false confession culture that materializes from this sort of Marxism, and like, how have you seen that play out in the military?
So one of the difficult problems in addressing culture, broadly speaking, is that every base is unique, every service is somewhat unique. Now, we do share some similar values and a similar mission, which is the defense of the nation and our allies. But I might be having a very different experience at my base than someone is having down in Colorado Springs, right down the road, or is having out in Alabama, for example. Now, so I won't pretend to know exactly what it is. I mean, you've probably seen more of these complaints, whistleblower complaints now, of course, than I have, although people are sending me examples as well. I've not experienced the forced confessions where I've worked. I've read of others that have. And but outside of the military, just to speak about society as a whole, one of the things that you read about all last calendar year is that there was an effort underway by some people to get people to essentially bow down and apologize for their privilege, to admit their guilt. That's not something that people get away with at a military installation that I could think of. And it brought me right back to Mao's Cultural Revolution, 1966. I had read a book by Fan Shun, who is a professor at a technical college in Minnesota, and he wrote it 17 years ago about his time when he was 12 years old participating in Mao's Cultural Revolution. And if you read his book called Gang of One, what you see in there looks an awful lot like USA 2020. And it's unbelievable. And the tactics are the same because the ideology that was fueling it is the same. And so whether it goes by, regardless of what name it goes by, what face or mask it puts on, the underlying impulse is one of, I've been treated unjustly. I'm angry about it, and by violent force, I can take what rightly belongs to me. For example, this victim mentality, there's an oppressor class that has to be overthrown. Those ideas are at the heart of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto 1848. Section 1 specifically is where that narrative is developed. And so once people wake up to the idea that that's in fact at play, it starts week after week to completely change the way they view everything that's going on right now in society. In my view, I've had dozens and dozens of people write me. Some of them are old. I mean, they served in the Vietnam War, and they said, hey, I fought in the Vietnam War. I had no clue what I was seeing take place was communist or Marxist in nature, socialist, call it what you will. And and they say, but now that I've read your book, I'm starting to see very clearly what's been going on. And it's not because my book is perfect. It's just because when your eyes are open to certain ideas, you start to see things a lot more clearly.
And you see where they've taken place in history. And that's what a lot of young people just don't know. You know, this game has been going on for a long time. You know, it's not new, but the tactics are the same, and it's easy to persuade a vulnerable and ignorant population that doesn't understand that these words actually mean something, that they're rooted in a much more sinister ideology that results in tens of millions of dead people, to be perfectly honest.
Right.
What would you suggest for service members who want to speak out, but military whistleblower protections aren't very strong? Obviously, you drew attention to yourself and were punished for it. I'm doing my best to take people's voices and amplify them, and I think we're doing a good job. I know for a fact that the leadership in the DoD has been paying very, very close attention to this, and they're kind of panicking over it. And look, and to be fair to some leaders, they don't really like this stuff, but they're also in denial that it's even happening to the extent that it is. And I think they're maybe realizing that with these very specific examples, and I'm hoping to see some real policy changes take place. Although I wish it happened more under Trump, because at least there was top cover. And now there's no top cover, so we'll see how that goes, because I think the Biden administration loves to see more CRT taught. But in any case, I think a lot of military leaders, even some of the ones that have been sort of defending this stuff, they don't actually believe it. So it's been very frustrating for us to kind of deal with that. But what can service members do? How should they react to this, and how can they speak out without getting fired or in trouble?
Well, I'm a firm believer that our military services should be non-politicized organizations, first off. And I believe in the importance of our service members remaining apolitical. Okay, so I want to say that up front. It's unfortunate to me that critical race theory, for example, which is rooted in Marxist ideology, has become a partisan issue in this country. I was fired for being politically partisan, but while it was a political ideology that I wrote about and have spoken up about, to me, it's not partisan to defend the Constitution of the United States, to defend the ideals in our Declaration of Independence, and to not be ashamed of whatever your political or religious views are in this country. So every service member should feel at liberty to believe how they would like to politically and religiously, and to stick up for themselves if they feel like they're being discriminated against illegally or unfairly based on their political persuasion, based on their religious views or their race. That's illegal to discriminate based on those reasons.
Do you think they should go to the Inspector General's office specifically?
Yes. Well, I think they should talk to their chain of command. And they should also file an IG complaint. That's what it's there for. I hope they'd listen.
Yeah.
One of the points that I've recently made is that not a single senior leader in the military has reached out to me in the past 6.5 weeks since publishing my book to ask me any question whatsoever about examples of extremism that I've teed up in my book. Now, I didn't mention people's names for a reason. I wasn't interested in damaging people's careers, but I'm hoping that we'll start to hold people accountable for their activism while in uniform.
Well, maybe we should mention their names. I mean, I'm not opposed to mentioning names. Frankly, we've been pretty vague in how we've released our whistleblower complaints, but
right, I
can always change my mind on that, and I think I probably will, to be honest, if we don't see changes.
Yeah, well, I figured, from where I sit, and I was a commander of a unit, I thought some things are told to me in confidence and privately, and I didn't want to betray confidences. Another thing was I didn't want to come across as vindictive. I start dragging people's names through the mud. It was more important to me to discuss the ideas so that others could take courage and say, you know what, I will not be discriminated against for my political outlook, my worldview, or my religion, or my race. All of those things we are entitled to believe and actually express or speak openly, but it doesn't mean we need to turn our workplaces into a politicized environment that's divisive.
And I think it's important. So like if service members are listening to this right now and they're like, okay, well, how do I file an IG complaint, and like what do I write in it? And because it's probably not something they think about every day. And I think based on this conversation, the proper thing to be writing in it is this training makes me feel like I'm being attacked for my race, makes me feel like I'm being attacked for my political beliefs. It forces me to share things and admit things in sort of this false confession way that I don't feel I should have to. So we do have like complaints about that. Like it's called sharing of significant emotional events, and some of the complaints were along these lines. Like I'm being forced to say I'm a racist when I'm not. And right. that should go against DoD policy. I mean, the methods being used here, rooted in CRT, should go against DoD policy. What's frustrating is the defenders of this stuff will say, it's not CRT. We don't believe in CRT. We're doing diversity and inclusion training. It's like, you're just renaming it. You're just renaming it. You're just being clever. But if you're telling people that they have to see race first, then that is rooted in CRT ideology.
Yeah, language makes things pretty tricky. It's hard to see things clearly when the words are all a mess, and people, it's like you need to get caught up on all the lingo year after year if you're going to make sure that you're aware of what's going on in the world, unfortunately. But yeah, I'd encourage service members to use their chain of command. I had someone email me just the other day, didn't forward this to you guys, but they said, hey, I want to share with you an email that I just had with my inspector general at the base. Mm-hmm. This was a senior enlisted leader at a particular base, and he wrote a couple of paragraphs to the inspector general at his base and said, I'm offended at what I'm seeing, reading, and hearing right now. And the first line in the response from the inspector general was, you shouldn't concern yourself too much with this. That's not the kind of response that our inspector generals need to be giving to our service members. It's certainly not the kind of response that commanders need to be giving to their personnel. And then write your elected officials, get them involved, talk about your experience if you're not getting any traction. I'm not trying to advocate for people to cause more division. I'm actually trying to heal the division, but you got to speak up. I mean, you can't just stay silent hoping the problem's going to go away. There are activists who will ensure this will never go away unless people speak up and stand their ground and stand up for their rights.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's one of the reasons that we've decided we needed to make such a hard push for this, because we did see these complaints sort of bubble up. I mean, obviously I have lots of ties to the military still, and it started well before this administration took place, but it really accelerated, it seemed to me. And the military being one of our last trusted institutions in America, it's so important that I think we save it and we stop this trend in its tracks. That's why we're doing this. Again, I don't think the problem so far is irreversible. Okay, I think a lot of our institutions, I think, is irreversible a long time ago, or will take decades to reverse. I mean, look at our universities. A lot of our federal institutions as well are just. Imagine the political leanings of the State Department, right? They're like, trust me, it's like 90% Democrat. But the military has long been nonpartisan, long been a meritocracy, long been inclusive in the right way. And this is about saving it. I mean, these efforts and I appreciate you doing it. It's much harder for you being active duty to be going on shows and actually speaking out about this. We're not going to let anything happen to you. At least we'll do our best anyway. But I think it's important for voices like yours to be heard. And you bring a good example too. I mean, look, you're still active duty. You're still allowed to talk about these things. You just can't do it in uniform, right? And so it does seem to me like on the left, they're happy to be going on CNN and talking about their transition to a different gender as an active duty service member, but more conservative or moderate members of the military think they're not allowed to say anything ever, and it's just not true. You got to speak up, I think the future and the readiness of our military is at stake here, because the reality is we've got much worse things to worry about with the rising China and mostly of China. and I think we need to be prepared for these kind of potential threats. And we can't do it if we're hyper focused on woke BS. So
yeah, I'll agree with you that this is I should be more specific what I'm saying. This has the potential to be a terrible distraction to us. But fortunately, for your American listener, my entire time in command this past year, despite some distractions, we've got excellent service members who always strive to be very focused on the mission that they're trained to do and be experts at, and keep that confidence. But there's just some political confusion and swirl and energy and emotion wrapped up in these issues at the moment. And so they've got to navigate that too, all the while being told that they're supposed to remain apolitical. And so when you find yourself in a politicized work environment and you're told you're supposed to be apolitical, but then you start to recognize that some political views actually go unchecked, and it's okay to be political if you have the right leanings, that's when you start to see this tension that you and I have been talking about. So, but I'm really grateful for our service members. They work very hard to do their mission, defend the American people, and do what they're asked, regardless of who's elected to office or who's in their chain of command.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and and people should understand that, right? It's not like our military looks like a Yale classroom, but we see those first signs of it, and we're going to put a stop to it. And I think that's what this is all about. Matt, appreciate you being on and writing that book and kind of helping people understand the roots of Marxism and how it's been infiltrating our most precious institutions. And you know what, you've made personal sacrifice for your views. So thank you for that, and thank you for being on.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I appreciate it.